This is the story of how America, the most powerful industrial nation on Earth, almost lost the war because it couldn't make enough bullets. Not for lack of steel, not for lack of workers, and not because enemy submarines were sinking the supply ships. The mightiest factories in history were simply falling behind month after month, and nobody could figure out why. By the summer of 1943, the numbers were terrifying. Marines in the Pacific were rationing rifle rounds. Infantry units training for the invasion of Sicily were cutting live-fire drills, afraid they wouldn't have enough left for the real thing. The War Department calculated that fighting on two fronts demanded roughly 2.5 billion rounds every single month, and American plants were producing barely half of that. Every round that didn't get made was a firefight that might be lost, a hill that might be abandoned, a soldier who might not come home. Here's the strange part. The problem wasn't a shortage of anything you could see or touch. It was a shortage of seconds. And the answer, when it finally came, didn't come from an engineer or a general or a boardroom in Washington. It came from a 19-year-old girl on a sweltering factory floor in Missouri, someone who remembered a machine from the Civil War that everyone else had forgotten. What she noticed would double a plant's output and ripple across every ammunition factory in the country. This is how it happened. The plant sat outside Independence, Missouri, and by mid-morning in July, it was already a furnace. Rows of stamping presses hammered brass into cartridge cups. Annealing ovens threw off waves of heat that pushed the air past 95 degrees. Conveyor belts clattered without pause, and over all of it hung a smell of hot metal, machine oil, and sweat. The floor employed thousands of workers, most of them women who had never set foot inside a factory before the war. They'd come from farms and kitchens and shop counters, and they'd learned in a matter of weeks to run machines that could take a hand off at the wrist. They worked 12-hour shifts in heat that would shut a modern office building down. And still, it wasn't enough. The bottleneck lived at one station, the feeder table, where raw brass casings had to be lined up and fed into the alignment tracks before they could be charged and crimped. It was the most delicate point in the whole operation, and it was still done entirely by hand, the same way it had been done since the last war. 6 women stood at the table, arms moving in tight, endless loops. Pick, place, slide, pick, place, slide. 3 motions, repeated thousands of times an hour. On a good hour, the line hoped for 30,000 fed casings. Most days it stalled out around 23,000. That gap doesn't sound like much until you multiply it across every line, across every hour, across the entire plant running around the clock. Then it becomes millions of missing rounds a day. And the reason for the gap was almost insulting in its smallness. One slipped grip, one jammed guide rail, one broken fingernail, and the whole sequence froze. Every stoppage meant recalibration, and every recalibration meant lost seconds. The women weren't slow. They were human, and human hands can only keep a rhythm for so long before fatigue starts to eat into it. The real enemy inside the plant wasn't sabotage or bad brass. It was those lost seconds, piling up invisibly, hour after hour, while somewhere in the Pacific, a machine gun crew was burning through ammunition faster than the factory could replace it. Among the workers on Line 4 was a girl we'll call Ruth Callahan, 19 years old, 12 weeks into the job, still learning the plant the way a new sailor learns the role of a ship. She wasn't an engineer. She earned 80 cents an hour. But she had one thing the engineers didn't. She was close enough to the problem to feel it in her own body. One morning, a guide rail snapped loose, and a spill of casings scattered across the concrete. The red warning lamp flashed. Production stopped. Supervisors sprinted in, mechanics rolled up their carts, and the women stepped back to wipe the sweat from their faces. Another 10 minutes gone. another chunk missing from the day's quota. And as Ruth knelt on the floor gathering the spilled brass, something about the motion of the women's hands caught her attention and wouldn't let go. She watched them resume. Pick, place, slide. And that's when she realized the motion wasn't really a line at all. The wrists looped. The shoulders rotated. It was circular, an orbit disguised as a straight path. The hands were already moving in a wheel. The machine just wasn't built to take advantage of it. Then a memory surfaced, from a high school history textbook of all places. A machine that spun to feed faster than any human hand could manage. Multiple stations, sharing the load, carried around by rotation, instead of forced through in a line. She almost laughed at herself. She was a teenager with a 9th grade education, not a designer of munitions equipment. But the thought wouldn't leave. And then the name came to her, Gatling. The old multi-barreled gun from the Civil War. The one that solved a problem everyone thought was unsolvable. How to fire faster without a barrel overheating, by rotating the barrels so each one had time to cool. 80 years old, sitting in a history book, solving in reverse the exact problem freezing her line every hour. What if you didn't feed the casings in a straight line at all? What if you let a wheel carry them? The idea was easy. Convincing anyone to look at it was not. Ruth had no drafting table, no authority, and no reason for anyone to listen. So she did the only thing she could. She scavenged. Between tasks, she picked through a scrap bin near the east wall. Broken pallets, bent brackets, a discarded bearing ring. She didn't know exactly what she needed, only that it had to turn without binding and hold weight without collapsing. Behind a stack of crates, she laid the pieces out on the concrete, arranging wooden slats around the bearing ring, trying to picture casings riding in shallow recesses along the edge. A mechanic found her there, kneeling over a wheel of scrap lumber. He raised an eyebrow. She braced for him to laugh. Instead, he asked a single question. What problem are you actually trying to solve? And when she said the word throughput, he stopped smiling. Throughput was a language everyone in that plant spoke. He didn't need to believe her idea. He just needed to believe the problem was real. They got 3 minutes. Nobody would shut a line down for a teenager's sketch, so the crew carved out a scrap of floor beside line 2, where a wooden mock-up could spin without hurting anyone if it flew apart. A half circle of tired workers gathered to watch. The mechanic bolted the crude wheel to a spindle, looped a belt from a spare motor, and flipped the switch. It was a disaster. The wheel wobbled, spun too fast, and threw casings across the bench like a child scattering marbles. The workers laughed, not cruelly, just honestly. The build was wrong. Too light, too fast, too uneven. But then the mechanic steadied it with both hands, tightened the belt, and slowed the rotation to something like the sweep of a lighthouse beam. Ruth set 3 more casings into the recesses. The wheel turned. One fed cleanly. The second corrected itself against the guide lip. The third wobbled and dropped exactly where it needed to. Nobody cheered, but something had shifted in the room. It wasn't success. It was proof that the motion made sense, and motion that made sense could be refined. That partial success was enough to buy the one thing Ruth couldn't scavenge, a real prototype. A procurement officer, watching the numbers on a plant that was falling behind quota, authorized the maintenance crew to build a steel version overnight. Under harsh white lamps, long after the day shift had gone home, sparks showered off a wheel cut from 1/4-inch steel, nearly 2.5 feet across. Its slots lined with rubber, scavenged from truck tires to kill the vibration. That weight was the whole point. In a plant where vibration killed good ideas faster than the heat did, the machine had to be heavy enough to hold its rhythm. When they finally set it spinning, it didn't rattle itself apart. It turned in a smooth, deliberate arc and fed 19 of 20 casings cleanly into the chute on the first run. After the chaos of a wooden wheel throwing brass across a bench that same afternoon, 19 out of 20 was staggering. The next morning, they bolted it onto line 2. The typical feed rate at that station was under 500 casings a minute. Within the hour, the counter pushed past 700, then 740, then 780. The women's hands moved with less strain. The whole line seemed to exhale, as if someone had loosened a knot in its spine. When the hourly output crossed a threshold, the plant had never hit that early in the day. Nobody cheered. This was a war plant, after all. They just stared at the counter as if it were lying. Within 6 months, the rotating feeder had spread to every major ammunition plant in the country. Engineers who understood torque and metallurgy far better than a 19-year-old ever could refined it, strengthened it, improved it. But the core idea never changed. Rotation instead of a line, a wheel instead of a row, a system that worked with human fatigue instead of against it. By D-Day, the men who hit the beaches at Normandy never ran short of bullets. The Marines fighting across the Pacific fired without rationing rounds, and almost none of them knew that part of their firepower traced back to an observation made on a sweltering factory floor in Missouri by a teenager who remembered a Civil War machine. Ruth Callahan is a stand-in, a name for the thousands of women whose specific stories were never written down. They received no medals and no parades. When the war ended, they were expected to hand the machines back and return to their kitchens as if nothing had happened. But they had won the war as surely as any soldier, not with rifles, but by proving that the arsenal of democracy wasn't built by a handful of great men. It was built by ordinary people, close enough to a broken system to feel it in their own hands, who refused to believe the numbers couldn't be changed.